For a while, it must have felt as though the escalator was finally moving. Government spending expanded, imports flooded in. The state began to think like a man who had mistaken a payday for a pension. Then prices weakened, and the hidden damage became clear. The World Bank described how oil dependence and mismanagement helped produce Dutch disease. In plain English, the oil sector became so dominant that agriculture and other tradable sectors lost ground. Nigeria, once a major agricultural exporter, slid into food imports. The non-oil economy did not collapse all at once. It thinned out. It thinned out like soil eroding under grass that still looks green from above. Look at what happened to poverty. The World Bank estimated that 43% of Nigerians lived in poverty in 1985. That figure fell to 34% in 1992. Then it reversed again after policy instability and falling living standards. Other Nigerian data sets put poverty even higher by the mid-1990s. Despite oil wealth on a historic scale, the country kept producing a society where millions remained exposed. Nowhere was the contradiction more visible than the Niger Delta itself. This was the region feeding the machine. Yet the United Nations described it as suffering from administrative neglect, crumbling social infrastructure, and high unemployment. It suffered from social deprivation, abject poverty, filth, squalor, and endemic conflict. It reads like a description of a colony being stripped. People there did not experience oil as a line on a GDP chart. They experienced it in their lungs, their water, and their fields. Gas flaring, burning off associated gas as waste, continued for decades, filling the sky with heat, noise, soot, and toxic air. Oil spills poisoned creeks and farmland. Amnesty documented how people in the Delta drank, cooked with, and washed in polluted water. They ate fish contaminated by oil and toxins and reported breathing problems and skin lesions. In Ogbodo, in River State, at least 26,500 barrels were spilled in 2001, contaminating the water supply of 42 communities. In Bodo Creek, a major spill in 2008 damaged mangroves and fisheries. One operator reported 221 spills per year between 1989 and 1994. Look at what happened next. The communities closest to the oil often became more dependent, polluted, and politically marginalized. This is one of the most important and least intuitive parts of the story. Oil does not only centralize money, it can centralize power while pushing damage outward. The revenue flows up to capitals and elite networks. The smoke, spills, and broken livelihoods stay where the drilling happens. Wealth rises like steam. The residue stays in the village. Nigeria shows that the curse is not only about bad kings and stolen millions, it is also about what gets crowded out. When a state can live from one export, it becomes easier to neglect the slow work of development. Building a port is fast. Building a generation that can read, save, invest, and build businesses is slow. Oil states often choose the photograph over the foundation. This leads to the third part of the story, and it takes us to Chad. Chad was not supposed to fail this test. In fact, the Chad-Cameroon pipeline project was sold at the turn of the century as a new model with oversight and revenue rules. If Equatorial Guinea was the warning and Nigeria the catastrophe, Chad was supposed to be the correction. A World Bank-backed deal helped launch a 650-mile pipeline from Chad through Cameroon to the Gulf of Guinea. Oil began pumping in late 2003. On paper, the early results looked dazzling as Chad GDP growth jumped from 11.9 to 29.7%. GDP per person rose from about $220.8 in 2002 to $660.2 by 2005. This was an economic thunderclap. The setup looked responsible. Chad had a petroleum revenue management law. 10% was meant for a future generations fund. Money was supposed to be directed to health, education, and rural development. In theory, the money had been tied to the mast. But oil money does not test paper rules. It tests power. And power in Chad was fragile, violent, and deeply political. As rebel threats rose and President Idris Deby faced pressure, the rules bent. In 2005, Chad changed the law. The Future Generations Fund was scrapped. The government doubled the share of direct revenue it could use more freely. Security was added to the list of priority spending areas, making it easier to buy arms. World Bank loans were suspended, assets were frozen, then later partially released under an interim deal. The model cracked almost immediately. The human result was familiar. A later World Bank study found that oil had a big short-term effect on GDP, but it did not last. Inequality rose between 2003 and 2011. Rural poverty remained high at 52.5% in 2011. Military and security spending increased fivefold between 2005 and 2009, from 0.8% to 8% of GDP. When oil prices dropped in 2014 and 2015, Chad was hit hard, with real GDP contracting 6.4% in 2016. That is the trap in its purest form. Oil gave Chad a rocket at liftoff, but no landing gear. The country rose quickly and dramatically, but because the oil sector did not build a diversified economy, the rise could not hold. Rural families still depended on low-productivity agriculture. Schools and health systems stayed weak. The boom was not a staircase, it was a trampoline. We like to imagine monitoring can stop corruption. Chad shows the limits of that hope. If a state is weak and built around elite survival, rules are like padlocks on a tent. By now, the pattern should be forming in your mind. Equatorial Guinea shows how oil can enrich a state while starving society. Nigeria shows us how oil zones can become sacrifice zones. Chad shows us that even frameworks fail when politics turns to survival. Most people will never know what you now know. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for. Now look at all three together. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. First, a big new flow of oil money enters the state. Second, leaders treat that flow as permanent or spend as if it were. Third, the economy bends around the oil sector. Farming, manufacturing, and small private enterprise get less attention and credit. Fourth, public money becomes easier to steal or misdirect because it arrives in giant concentrated streams. Fifth, when prices fall or fields decline, the country discovers that its apparent strength was a stage set. The curse is not that oil exists. The curse is that oil is easy money in a place not built to handle easy money. It arrives faster than institutions can mature. It enriches rulers before it educates citizens. It rewards central control. In normal development, a country becomes richer because millions of people gradually become more productive. In the oil curse, the state becomes richer first. Oil states often build visible things because visible things are politically useful. Roads, airports, conference halls, monumental districts. But when $80 out of every 100 go to construction while only 2 or 3 go to health and education, it is a camera-friendly economy. It is like feeding all the paint to the walls and none of the food to the children. Once the boom slows, the damage becomes social. The young discover that the jobs never spread. The middle class discovers that the institutions are thin. Rural families discover that the price of imported food rises faster than opportunities. This brings us directly to the human cost. The first people hurt are usually the least organized and the easiest to ignore. Rural farmers, urban informal workers, children in public schools, and patients in public clinics are the ones standing on the floor when the ceiling caves. Angola, after the Civil War, is a powerful example. Oil money poured into reconstruction and into networks of power surrounding the president. For outsiders, Luanda looked like a boomtown, but about 2/5 of Angolans still lived below the poverty line. More than $4 billion in state oil revenue disappeared from government coffers between 1997 and 2002. It means a mother sees an office tower rise, but not a maternity ward. A mechanic watches luxury cars glide past potholes. Oil wealth can turn post-war hope into a glass city that reflects the poor without admitting them. Equatorial Guinea produced the same split. Official points were highways and airports, but the social floor was weak. And one of the strangest facts in history, a country that became Africa's richest by income still failed to immunize children. It was as if the nation had been given a luxury watch while still living in a house with no roof. In the Niger Delta, a fisherman does not care that oil exports strengthen the balance of payments if the creek smells like fuel. A child does not care that the country posted higher revenue if the night sky burns from gas flares and the clinic has no medicine. In these places, the oil economy does not feel like wealth. It feels like extraction passing overhead. The winners tend to be those closest to the pipe: political families, intermediaries, and foreign firms inside the enclave. In oil states, wealth often behaves like elevator access in a locked building. A few people go straight to the top floors. There's another group that loses. The middle layer that should have been the spine of a healthy economy, like teachers and nurses. In an oil-dominant economy, they can become spectators to a boom they are told belongs to them. The country grows tall but not wide. Real prosperity is width. It is millions of ordinary people becoming harder to push over. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the lucky few who sat closest to power. I mean the countries that turned wealth into something sturdier. They treated the boom as temporary. They built rules stronger than personalities, and they protected the non-resource economy. Botswana avoided the worst of the resource curse by running budget surpluses and accumulating international reserves. They refused to start public projects without a plan to cover their long-term costs. Development is not ribbon cutting, it is a recurring bill. Norway provides the oil version. It built a sovereign wealth fund and followed a rule that only a small share should be spent. They treated oil as something to convert into long-term stability, not as a costume party for the present. They respected boring competence. The people who came through best did not assume the boom story was permanent. They invested in portable skills that could travel across sectors. They stayed close to productive work, not just political favor. They tried to own useful things rather than impressive things. Land that produced, education that compounded, and businesses tied to real demand acted like lifeboats tied to the dock. This is not financial advice. It is pattern recognition. When states become dependent on easy money, resilient people stay skeptical. They ask the unglamorous questions. Who will maintain this? What happens when the price falls? Can this system work without the commodity? And now we return to the taxi driver in Malabo on 30th of July, 2003. He probably did believe something had changed forever. The oil was real. The money was real. But the promise that national wealth would automatically become security was an illusion. Years later, the roads might be smoother, but if his children faced weak schools and water remained unreliable, the promise was not kept. History shows that resource wealth does not remove a nation's deepest weaknesses. It concentrates them. It accelerates them. Wealth from the ground is only as good as the institutions above it and the society around it. Oil can build a country, but it can also build a stage set of prosperity while leaving the foundations soft. And when the music stops, soft foundations do what they always do. They sink. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone.